Hello, everybody. So this presentation is a deep dive to the recent Mikrotik exploits and the security analysis of the Mikrotik exploits in the last about a year and a half. So my name is Tomas. As you can see, I will be speaking English throughout this presentation. Sorry. And I'm a system and network architect, but what I really like most and what I do most of is automation and monitoring. I'm also a Mikrotik trainer and consultant, and for the last about 3 years, I have been working with Unimis. We are a automation and a configuration management solution. If you would like to know more, we have a booth outside, so feel free to come to me outside should you have any questions. And so yeah, this is just for people who see this online sometimes in the future, because a lot of my presentations get their ways on YouTube and otherwise. So this is not really for you that are here. So why this presentation and what we'll be talking about? Well, the number of attacks against RouterOS has been increasing dramatically in the last 3 months. I am sure you have seen many articles around the internet on the exploits, on what has been happening. And so we are here to learn how to defend our networks. And to do that, we will analyze past RouterOS attack vectors and exploits. And we will discuss the current situation with the ongoing exploits around the world and the exploits which are live right now around the internet. So before we start, a little bit of refresher. Hopefully all of you already know this, but we will still repeat. So RouterOS runs on Linux. So if you have access to the underlying Linux system, RouterOS is just like any other normal Linux machine. So you can pretty much do anything with RouterOS if you have access to the underlying Linux system. And RouterOS runs on many architecture. It runs on MIPS, it runs on ARM, it runs on Tile. But that's not really a problem for attackers as long as you compile your payloads for the proper architecture, which all of the attackers will do. So a few shortcuts which we will use throughout this presentation, which might need explaining. So I hope all of you knows what WikiLeaks is. It's a website which frequently publishes leaked documents from secret services of governments around the planet. CIA and NSA, those are American intelligence organizations. Vault 7, we will talk about this really soon. And since we will be referring to RCE and CNC throughout the presentation, RCE means remote code execution, and CNC means command and control servers. So we will be using these shortcuts throughout the presentation. Okay. So before we even begin, it's really important to understand that Mikrotik default configurations were never affected by any of the recent exploits. So all of these exploits would not be possible if proper firewalling and security was implemented across your networks. So in reality, the only way to get affected with everything that we will be talking about in this presentation was either if the default firewall was modified, or if the configuration was reset and firewall was not configured at all, or if firewall was configured but management services were not properly protected. So here we mean web, SSH, Vinbox, API, and the other management services which RouterOS exposes. So about security. The point of this presentation is not to say that Mikrotik is bad at security, because that is simply not true. Every single piece of software will have bugs and vulnerabilities. If you want examples of this, Cisco actually had a very major security vulnerability just a year ago, where millions of Cisco's SAAs were vulnerable across the internet. And actually just last week, Juniper published 12 high severity vulnerabilities on their website. So this is not just Mikrotik that has these vulnerabilities that can be exploited by attackers. Every single piece of software will inevitably have bugs and vulnerabilities. So again, what is the point? We are here to learn how to protect ourselves from bad actors across the internet. And we are here to see how to make a Mikrotik network secure against outside exploitation. With an asterisk there, because nothing is really 100% secure, you know the old joke, if you want it to be secure, then unplug the power. But we are still here to see how we can best defend ourselves from bad actors. So, how did all of this happen that's happening in the Mikrotik security world right now? Well, the answer is Vault 7. So, let's start at the beginning of the story, which is in March 2017, when CIA/NSA attack tools were leaked on WikiLeaks, and this leak is known as Vault 7. So these leaks contained attack utilities for multiple systems, for Windows, Linux, Unix, and for many different routers, including Mikrotik. If you want to see more about this, you can check out the WikiLeaks page linked here. So yeah, a part of these leaks was actually a RouterOS attack module used by CIA and NSA, and it was named Chimay Red. And this module contained two exploits for RouterOS. A HTTP server exploit that allowed RCE, remote code execution, and a Vinbox exploit that allowed arbitrary file read on the router. So, let's talk about how these vulnerabilities, which became public, were used by hackers and attackers across the internet. So first of all, we have the RouterOS web server vulnerability, which allowed remote code execution to anyone simply by seeing TCP port 80 open on a Mikrotik RouterOS device. So yeah, the web server in Mikrotik, which Mikrotik uses for webfig, for graphs, for anything when you connect to port 80 on a Mikrotik device, had the vulnerability which allowed RCE. This means that the attackers could actually directly execute commands on the underlying Linux system simply by visiting or sending a specially crafted packet to TCP port 80. Of course, when you have access to the underlying Linux system, you can execute also any RouterOS commands and change any RouterOS configuration as well. So, Chimay was meant and could be used, of course, to deliver arbitrary payloads to RouterOS devices. And WikiLeaks or the actual Vault 7 leaks, there was no exact payloads available in the leaks, so it is unknown what the original intent of the CIA and NSA was and what they wanted to deliver by this exploit. But what it was used for on the internet was actually, this particular exploit at least, was actually not that widely used, at least compared to what we'll be discussing further on in this presentation. So there is not much public data either on how bad actors used this particular vulnerability, since exploitation was not very widespread. Of course, as we move more forward into this presentation, we will see that exploits which are running wild on the internet today still fall back to this vulnerability if it's available. So how did Mikrotik respond to this? Well, Mikrotik released fixes to all branches of RouterOS pretty much immediately. And what was the impact? Well, the impact of this module 1 exploit was actually quite small, again, compared to what we will be discussing further into the presentation. Since default config of Mikrotik was not affected, and it seems that most of the publicly available Mikrotiks actually had firewall for the web interface, for the web service. Therefore, the impact was quite limited. So, still, how could we defended against this? Well, the answer is very simple, just by proper firewalling. Since the vulnerability was in the web service, as long as the web service was properly protected by firewall and was not publicly available and reachable, then this could not be exploited. Optionally, we also simply need to upgrade RouterOS to the latest version where this is patched, and again, we would not be vulnerable. Okay, so if you were exploited, how can you fix this? How can you remediate? The only sure answer here is net install. Since this exploit actually allowed arbitrary remote code execution, this means that the underlying Linux system has been compromised, which means that updating RouterOS after you have been compromised might not be enough, because there might be certain rootkits in place, there might be certain files on the file system in place, which will reinfect the router even after upgrade. And just resetting configuration would not also help, because if you reset the configuration, you only reset the configuration of the RouterOS system, not of the underlying Linux system. So the only answer, the only way to get this fixed is to net install, because net install formats the flash and installs a clean system. So since the hard drive, since the flash is formatted, this means that whatever payload was delivered to the router would be cleaned. Okay, so now we have part 2 of this presentation, where we see what happened about 3 months after the initial WikiLeaks leak, which was a Vinbox client-side exploit, where attacking the administrator workstation was actually possible through infected routers. So, while all of this was happening, while module 1 of ChimaiRed was utilized, a new exploit was discovered, and this is that Vinbox could be used to deliver malicious DLLs to the administrator machine. So, what actually happened is that Vinbox would load and execute arbitrary DLLs delivered as part of connecting to older RouterOS devices. So these DLLs were used by RouterOS version 5 and older, and are not used in version 6 anymore. So this particular way to exploit has been known for quite some while, for actually years. But before ChimaiRed came along, there were no known vulnerabilities which would allow you to infect the underlying Linux system, and therefore this payload delivery was not really practical. But after ChimaiRed, you could actually affect the underlying Linux system, and therefore you could deploy payloads which delivered malicious DLLs across the Vinbox connection. So, since Vinbox didn't do any signing or verification of the DLLs delivered as part of connecting to RouterOS, it was super easy for anybody to simply deploy a malicious DLL, which would be loaded and executed by Vinbox, and the computer of the administrator would be compromised through these DLLs. So someone could simply compromise your computer just by you connecting to a infected Mikrotik router. So visualizing this is really simple. You have your administrator PC, you connect to an infected Mikrotik, which delivers malicious DLLs as part of the Vinbox connection, and your computer gets hacked. So, when did this first appear in the wild? Was in March 2018. And in March 2018, it was discovered that this particular method was used across the internet, and was actually publicly used to infect computers of network administrators. So as we mentioned multiple times, Chimai was used to deliver payload to routers, and routers were used to inject payload to Vinbox sessions of administrators. So what was the Mikrotik response? Well, a new version of Vinbox was released very shortly after this was discovered that does not support DLL loading anymore. So as a side effect, this cut away the legacy support for connecting to RouterOS version 5, which is okay since RouterOS version 5 has been deprecated for many years at this point. So the impact of this is actually unknown, but likely very, very small. What is known to the public is that this attack was used to attack very specific targets across Middle East and Africa by state actors of certain nations. But really, publicly, this was not widespread because, first of all, it required you to exploit the router itself to deliver the malicious DLLs, or having the administrator connect to a different router that the attacker controlled. So it was hard to execute this on mass scale, and therefore this was used only for targeted attacks. So, how could have we defended against this? Well, first of all, make sure to keep your Vinbox up to date. If there is any vulnerabilities, Mikrotik will patch it, and as long as you use latest versions of software, you will be fine. So, how to protect number 2 is make sure to protect your router. Since, as we mentioned, this exploit required the router to be compromised first. So, if your router is never compromised, you would not be vulnerable to this particular exploit. And additionally, do not connect to unknown random routers. If you don't control the router and you have a vulnerable version of Vinbox, then you are at risk because you don't know what the router is delivering. So make sure to follow good security practices and you will be okay. So how to remediate if you were affected by this? Sadly, this is a really complex discussion, since this particular attack was against the operating system of your computer, not of the Mikrotik. And therefore, remediation is not simple. So even reinstalling your operating system might not be enough, because these days, advanced malware can actually hide in MBR, in recovery partitions, even in BIOS, or even with the recent Meltdown, Spectre, Rise and Fall, Master Key, Foreshadow. If any of you follow the security world, you will know what these attacks are. These attacks are actually attacks against the processors. Intel has had a number of hardware vulnerabilities, and AMD has had a number of hardware vulnerabilities as well, which actually allow rootkit installation into the security chip inside of the processor. So this is a really complex discussion of how to remediate your workstation once it has been potentially infected, and it's way out of scope of this presentation, so we will just continue for now. So part 3. As time moved on, attackers find out that they could use attack module 2 of ChimaiRed. If you remember, this was Vinbox arbitrary file read vulnerability. So at first, when WikiLeaks published the original Vault 7, it took a little bit for attackers to figure out how to replicate and use this vulnerability. But what this vulnerability did allow is that anyone could read any file on the router just by seeing TCP port 8291 opened, the Vinbox port. So you could read any file on the router as long as you could see Vinbox port. And a new saga was born. So a whole new set of exploits that utilize this particular vulnerability are running wild around the internet right now. So all of the previously discussed exploits were actually quite low impact compared to what has been happening in the last 3 months and why I am standing here. So let's talk about the current situation, about what's happening in the Mikrotik security vault right now and what you should do to be safe. Because right now it's quite dangerous if you don't secure your router properly. So, as we said, ChimaiRed module 2 allows arbitrary file access through a Vinbox vulnerability. Essentially, this allows anyone to retrieve the contents of the file system of the router through the Vinbox port. And when you can read any files on the router, you can read the user database. And the user database contains the credentials to your router. Which means that attackers, simply by seeing the Vinbox port, could actually retrieve credentials used to log into your router. So, as you can imagine, this is very serious and very dangerous. So yeah, any unauthenticated attacker, if you didn't secure your Vinbox port, could steal your credentials. After they stole your credentials, the attackers would simply connect to Vinbox with the credentials that they now had, that they retrieved, that they were valid. So essentially, if the Vinbox port was open, anyone could take over your router. And this is why you need to secure your routers. So a huge wave of exploits started. So in the first days of August 2018, it was first publicly discovered that there was a very big botnet attack that successfully exploited over 200,000 routers in Latin America. And this was the first time that the Vinbox vulnerability was successfully used for a large-scale attack across Mikrotik routers. As you can imagine, exploiting and capturing access to 200,000 routers, that's a serious mass-scale attack. So what was the Mikrotik response? Well, there wasn't much of a response because by this point, it has been fixed for more than half a year. So this vulnerability has been fixed for half a year already, and attackers still found 200,000 routers which were not patched and not properly firewalled that they could exploit. Just for reference, if you are running versions older than what is currently on screen, you are still vulnerable to this attack vector. So this shows you why we need to protect our networks, because if an exploit has been patched for half a year and attackers are still utilizing it today for mass-scale attacks, then sadly, we as a community of network administrators are not taking care of our networks properly. So, after the attackers gained access to the routers, what did they do? Well, so there are actually many variants of this attack currently running wild on the internet. We know, or at least our company has seen at least 6 separate families of malware distributed by various botnets around the world that use this vulnerability to attack infrastructure. So, the impact of this was huge, as we mentioned multiple times. In Latin America alone, 200,000 routers were exploited. And since the discovery of this initial exploit in the beginning of August, additional routers were exploited, and estimates now estimate that more than 400,000 routers around the world have been exploited. And what is even worse is currently there is still more than 500,000 Mikrotiks around the internet that are publicly available and vulnerable. So by the end of these numbers, you can see that more than 1 million Mikrotik routers around the planet are not properly secured and have either been exploited already or are still open to exploits. So, we mentioned that there is about at least 6 different families of malware. So let's look at some examples of what the attackers did and how the malware behaves once it is deployed on a router. So, what I call variant 1 is the original first mass-scale attack that hit Latin America in early August. And the goal of this particular botnet or of this particular attack was very simple. The attack injected cryptocurrency mining JavaScript into any websites visited by clients behind the router. So the goal was simple, to make money. So basically, this caused any client behind the router that visited any website to mine cryptocurrency for attackers. So in particular, Monero mining was used because Monero is a cryptocurrency which is meant to be mined by JavaScript deployed in the browser. And of course, the police was involved and etc. Multiple target Monero wallets were identified, some were seized, but reality is that, that attackers made some nice cryptocurrency on this one. So how was this done, technically? Well, attackers, once they captured control over a router, deployed a web proxy. And then NAD rules were deployed that utilized redirect to redirect web traffic from the clients to the web proxy running on the router. And then multiple scripts were put on the router that served as command and control delivery methods. So attackers could actually reconfigure the routers live by schedulers which pulled scripts from command and control servers. This was actually used to, for example, change target Monero wallets for mining once one wallet was seized, or allowed attackers to update the web proxy configuration to deploy newer versions of JavaScript mining the cryptocurrency. So how this worked was pretty simple. There was an infected Mikrotik, and any PC on a network behind the infected Mikrotik, first of all, it wanted to go to a website. Okay, so the traffic was captured by web proxy on the infected Mikrotik. It retrieved the website and returned the website to the client, but with injected malicious JavaScript inside of the website. And this caused the browsers of the clients to mine cryptocurrency for the attackers. So the common systems of this original attack were, first of all, there was a service user created on the router. New scripts were added to the router, and new scheduler entries were added. Web proxy was enabled and configured, and NAT and firewall were modified by attackers to facilitate this particular attack. So, as I said, this is the original variant that infected Latin America. But soon after that, a second generation of exploits and attacks came. And this second generation was a little bit different, because this one focused on setting up SOX proxy on the router, and through the SOX proxy, directly attacking the local network after the router or behind the router. So additionally, this SOX proxy could then be used to attack third-party services anonymously. So let's visualize this. How did this work? Okay, well, first let's talk about it a little bit more. So yeah, what they done was set up SOX proxy. And, okay, so we actually already talked about this. So yeah, visualizing this. So that's actually quite simple. Attack servers on the internet would simply attack machines directly inside of the local network through the infected router using SOX proxy. So if you have been in security for a little bit, you know that the end machines are what you want to go after. There is most processing power on the end user machines because they have strong CPUs to mine cryptocurrency. There is personal data on the machines. You can infect the end user machines with malware that encrypts the hard drive and then can request some Bitcoin to unencrypt your private data, etc., etc., etc. The point is, just by infecting a Mikrotik router and deploying SOX proxy, you could attack end user machines directly. And as we mentioned, there is a second use case for this, for attackers. By having a SOX proxy, the attacker can utilize the infected router to attack third parties anonymously, because to the victim, it will appear that the attack is coming from the infected router, not from the original attacker, which gives anonymity to the original attacker. So this, for example, when the attacker wanted to infect more routers, he could infect additional routers from the first infected router and therefore remain completely anonymous. So what were the symptoms? Actually, the symptoms on the infected router were very similar to variant 1. So there was a service user, there was a scheduler, there was scripts, there were net entries. Additionally, though, SOX proxy was enabled and reconfigured to facilitate attacks. So actually, very shortly after all of this happened, variant 1 and variant 2 of these attacks merged and became a single malware family, which shows us that both of these variants were probably utilized by a single attacking entity, which then merged the two separate botnets into one and merged the configurations to utilize attacks. So yeah, you could very commonly find web proxy and SOX proxy deployed alongside themselves and alongside all the other malicious configuration. So as time went on, more variants, and as this exploit became more popular, more variants came in. So me personally, what I call the variant 1 and variant 2 is the first generation of attacks, because they were historically in the timeline first to exploit routers. And these mostly affected Latin America and Africa and Asia. So soon after came the second generation of attacks, and this second generation of attacks was actually mostly distributed across the US and European address spaces. So this was probably a different attacking entity that focused on US and Europe. And this time around, DNS interception and redirection was the goal. So what was done is that on the router, DNS server was enabled and used malicious upstream DNS server. And then in net, a transparent DNS hijack was performed. Basically, the router would redirect all TCP UDP 53 traffic to itself. Therefore, it would capture DNS queries of the entire network behind the router. So by controlling DNS, attackers now controlled traffic routing. In here, we don't mean routing from the networking routing, but through routing of layer 7 requests. So attackers could now control, if the user wanted to go to Google, they could translate Google to a different address than Google actually is, and therefore could control where traffic from clients would go. And many, many attacks are possible here, since basically attackers gained complete control of where traffic from the client goes. So visualizing this is quite simple. So any PC on a network behind the infected router wants to go to a host name, for example, Google. Well, the router would intercept this DNS query. It wouldn't send it to the real DNS server configured on the PC. Instead, it would intercept the query, send the query to a malicious DNS server, and respond back to the original computer with whatever attacker wanted to achieve, with whatever the attacker wanted to exploit. So as we mentioned, this gave complete control of traffic routing to the attackers. And it doesn't matter if the computer had a static DNS settings, because the interception was done on the network layer. So as you can imagine, this is really dangerous, and again, it gave attackers a way to directly attack machines in the local network behind infected Mikrotiks. So since this second generation of exploits, there have actually been many more variants of these exploits utilizing the Vinbox vulnerability, and new exploits are popping up still even today. So this is still very active on the internet right now. And for example, we even saw some variants that checked against a command and control server with MAC address of Ethernet 1 as an identifier of the router. So the attackers are getting quite sophisticated here, because they are keeping a database of all of the routers they infect, and they are using Ether1 MAC address as a unique identifier, and therefore they can actually instruct individual routers to perform different attacks, or they can use groups of routers for geographically focused attacks. So for example, routers from Indonesia attack an Indonesian server, whereas routers from US attack a US server. And so it's getting quite sophisticated. So actually, about, I think, 3 weeks ago, a new variant appeared. And this new variant goes even further, because it captures unencrypted traffic on the router, such as Telnet, FTP, email communication through POP, IMAP, and SMTP, all unencrypted HTTP, SNMP, etc. So how does this work? Well, any PC on a network behind the infected router wants to send or receive email. Okay, the infected router captures the traffic, and inside of this traffic captures usernames and passwords. And then these usernames and passwords are sent to a malicious attacker-controlled server. And now the attackers know the username and password to your email. If you log into a non-HTTPS website, so if you log into any website using HTTP, now they know your login credentials to that website. If you use FTP, now they know your login credentials to that FTP server. So again, they are utilizing infected routers, and they are utilizing network architecture to directly attack the end users by capturing credentials and then utilizing those credentials to further attack the services that the user utilized. An obvious example is here simply to hijack email accounts for sending spam, or to hijack email accounts to be able to recover passwords to different services. You know, if you use Facebook, you always have that option, you know, I forgot my password, and or whatever other, or even your bank, you know, depending on how the security of the bank is. Of course, they will send you a link to reset your password to your email. Well, if the attackers already have credentials to your email because they exploited, because they captured those credentials when your email communication was not encrypted and going to that router, it gives attackers many more tools to attack, you know, to bootstrap additional attacks. So yeah, all together now. Well, in most currently active exploits that are going on right now around the internet, attack patterns stay the same as discussed above. So most of the currently active variants of these exploits, of these malwares, utilize all of these tools. So they intercept web traffic and inject cryptocurrency mining. They utilize SOCs to directly attack local networks, or for spoofing of attack traffic. They hijack DNS to control DNS, and they capture unencrypted traffic. So basically, anything you do, if your router has been exploited, the attackers will know about it, because they utilize all the possible ways to capture and redirect your traffic. So, signs of infection. How to know if your router has been infected? Well, look for modified HTTP proxy settings. Look for new users being created on the router which you didn't put there, like the service user utilized by the first variant of these exploits. Look for SOCs, looks for suspicious scripts being presented on the router, use for strange schedules that might be there. look for changed DNS settings, look for net and firewall being reconfigured, and finally look for traffic sniffer enabled, which sniffs and captures unencrypted traffic. So, after all of this, how could have we defended? Well, it's very simple. Just have proper firewall. If only your routers were properly protected using firewall, none of this would be possible. So simply make sure no public access is allowed to the Vinbox service. That's it. If firewall is blocking access to Vinbox, the attackers will not be able to utilize the Vinbox vulnerability, and they will not be able to infect their routers. So secure access to Vinbox with an address list, use a management VPN, use port knocking, use anything other than having public access to Vinbox, because having public access to Vinbox will be bad. Additionally, make sure your RouterOS is up to date. As we have mentioned, these exploits were fixed more than half a year ago. So simply make sure your RouterOS system is up to date. That's all it needs to be safe. So yeah, I just have to repeat again what we said in the beginning. Default configurations were never affected. So the only way to be affected by this is because the router was not configured in a secure way. So there was unsecure configuration by having management interfaces exposed publicly, or there was no firewall at all, which is a big mistake. So how to protect yourself going forward? Well, we said proper security is super important. Make sure you were not exploited by checking your configurations. And one really good tool you can actually use is configuration change notifications. So make sure you have some configuration monitoring system which will notify you when the configuration of your router changes. So as soon as attackers exploit your router, you get the notifications about the configuration change, and you know that something bad has happened. So, as I mentioned in the beginning, I work with Unimus, and this is one of the things we do. If you are interested, come and talk to me later. We have a booth. So, again, how can you remediate? How can you fix if you have been exploited? Well, for the original variant 1 and variant 2, we actually have a blog article on our website that will tell you all of the steps, all of the configuration you need to do to remove the infection from your router. For generation 2, the exploits that affected DNS, well, you will have to fix DNS and NAT and remove the DNS redirect from NAT. Sadly, for newer exploits, this is much more complicated. Since, as we said, now the exploits utilize many different configurations to capture and do bad things. So you will have to check your entire configuration for things that should not be there, and reset configuration or reset configuration and reconfigure from scratch. Again, I hope for your networks you have some system that does configuration backups. So you should have a configuration backup system, and you can pull the last valid configuration from your backup system to restore it on your router before it was infected. Again, this is one of the things that Unimus does. As I mentioned, if you are interested, come talk to us later. So, super important, change passwords. As we said, the user database from the router was retrieved by the attackers, by the vulnerability, which means that the attackers have your passwords, the username and password for your router. So even if you upgrade RouterOS, if you don't change the password, the attackers will simply connect back and reinfect your router because they have your passwords now. So make sure after you clean up your router, after you upgrade RouterOS, make sure to change your password so you do not get infected again. I have seen so many people on the forums complaining, oh, I have cleaned this up and now I have been reinfected again. Well, you need to change your password. Okay, and so as I was making this presentation last week, I have some very fresh news just from last week. So last week, it was discovered that the Vinbox directory traversal vulnerability can now be used for remote code execution. And this makes it even more serious now, because this means that attackers can now execute any commands on the underlying Linux system simply by seeing the Vinbox port opened. So as we said in the beginning of this presentation, 500,000 routers around the world are still vulnerable. So now, all of those 500,000 routers, the attackers can directly install infections and malware onto the underlying RouterOS Linux just by seeing the Winbox port open. And this is really serious, and things are about to get much worse than they were in the last 3 months. So attackers will be able to install crypto mining software directly on routers now. So your router can actually mine cryptocurrency for attackers now because they have access to the underlying Linux system. Attackers will be able to deploy malware that won't go away by resetting configuration. So since the attacks will now focus on the underlying Linux system, not just on RouterOS, well, resetting the configuration won't help anymore. Even upgrading RouterOS might not help anymore because the rootkit, the malware, might be installed in a way that preserves it even after updating RouterOS. And of course, since attackers have full control of the Linux now, of the Linux core of RouterOS, they can actually attack local networks directly from the router. They can perform attacks on your Windows machine from the router. They can perform attacks on the infrastructure of the ISP directly from the routers of their clients, etc., etc. This is getting really serious now. So if your router gets compromised now, the only way to make sure it's secured is to net install. Reset configuration won't help, upgrade won't help. You have to net install when you get compromised. Because as we mentioned, with the remote code execution vulnerability, malware can be installed directly in the underlying Linux system. So, what is the takeaway from this presentation? What should you leave here with is, please secure the management ports on your router. Do not leave them open to the public. It's a very, very bad security practice. You shouldn't do it. So, have proper firewall. Make sure management services on the router are protected, not publicly available, and upgrade RouterOS and upgrade Vinbox. Make sure you are running latest stable releases of the software. If your routers have been compromised, make sure to net install. Nothing short of net install will protect you from this point. And make sure you change passwords, because the password database from the router has been leaked through the exploits. And as I said previously, have configuration change notifications and have backups. It will make it much easier for you to, first of all, spot that this has happened, that your router has been exploited. Second of all, if you have backups, it will be much simpler to recover. So that's it from me. If you would like some additional resources to listen to or to check out, I have a YouTube channel. I do a lot of presentations on MAMs. So you can find all of my presentations from all of the previous MAMs on my YouTube channel. I like these deep dive presentations where I focus on a single topic. I am also a part of the Brothers Wisp, which is a bi-weekly networking podcast. It's in English, of course, but you can check it out here. Give us a listen if you would like. And that's it from me. Thank you very much for your attention. If you have any questions, feel free to come to me after. I'm down there in the hall, and I would be happy to talk to you further about this. Thank you very much again.